Throughout these videos I have suggested that manual exposure is the best way to proceed. It's a great way to learn about exposure because when we choose an auto setting it can be a little bit like out of sight, out of mind. However, here I want to talk about exposure compensation, and that's not really relevant in a manual mode. So I'd like you to switch to aperture priority. Aperture priority is our way of saying to the camera, I'll take care of the aperture, you take care of the shutter speed. Shutter priority is much the same. In that case, we would be saying to the camera, look, shutter is the important thing for me, so I'll take care of that, you take care of the aperture. So a typical shooting style using aperture priority may be frame up on our shot, focus, select the aperture we think is appropriate, and fire. So the very next thing we're likely to do is to take a quick look at the LCD screen on the back of the camera to make sure the exposure looks okay. If we need to adjust the exposure, and to do that we change the aperture, the camera is just going to compensate with the shutter because we've chosen to shoot aperture priority. It's a semi-automatic mode. No matter how much we change the aperture, the camera would compensate, so the amount of light falling on the sensor would be exactly the same. So with aperture priority, shutter priority and program, we need a way to tell the camera to bias the exposure one way or the other, and to do that we use the exposure compensation. You're likely to find this very easy to hand on the body of your camera, either a wheel on the back as we show here, or maybe a rocker switch with some makes of camera. So let's assume that we've selected f11, perhaps because we want to maximize the depth of field in our picture, but then we need to adjust exposure. As we turn the wheel or hit the rocker switch, we'll see the exposure pointer in our viewfinder reflect the change we've just made. But any increase or reduction in exposure will be done automatically by the camera on the shutter because we've selected aperture priority. Here I've compensated plus one stop. The f11 aperture remains in place because we're shooting aperture priority. However, to allow that extra stop of exposure, the shutter has been slowed to 1 second. Remember, that's doubling the light falling on the sensor. Here I've used my compensation wheel to minus one stop. So once again the f11 aperture remains untouched, but the shutter speeds up to 1/4 of a second to reduce the exposure by one stop, in fact halving the light. If we're using the camera on a tripod and we may not have the camera up to our eye, it's interesting to see that the changes are shown to us also on the top plate and along the bottom of the LCD in live view mode. Remember, exposure compensation will remain set with some cameras even after you've turned the camera off. Come back a little bit later and turn the camera back on and you'll find that the exposure compensation is still there. So you need to be aware of that.